Hello everybody. So as with the previous couple of weeks, this is just an additional recording to cover maybe a couple of additional points or to provide a little bit of background information to the live lecture which we had during the week. And the focus of today is really just going to give a little bit more information about ADDIE and also about the Assure model. Now I would say none of this information is critical, so yeah, this is just kind of some additional information in case it's of use to you, but it's nothing that you have to kind of sweat about. So just kind of very briefly to add to maybe a little bit of what was briefly mentioned in the live session, one thing which is interesting to note is that the US military had a lot of influence on e-learning, and the ADDIE system kind of came about because of this. I mentioned it during the live session as well, but potentially something to note was that the Department of Defense had a unit called Advanced Distributed Learning, or ADL, which was put together to try and standardize and modernize training and education within the Air Force. And they were the ones who came up with the very first versions of SCORM, the e-learning kind of packaging standard. And kind of going further back, again, something I mentioned in the live lecture, but the Department of Defense also had this wing called ARPA, which was Advanced Research Project Agency, and they were the ones who to come up with the kind of concept of TCP/IP, which became the kind of technical foundation of the internet. And one thing which the Air Force also developed in 1970 was this 5-step approach, which even now, as you can kind of see from it, does kind of follow similar enough principles, even visually, to instructional design models like ADDIE and, as we'll see, like Assure. So the tasks that were involved, or the phases that were involved in this 5-step approach, was first off to analyze system requirements. So again, very similar to the analyze phase that we saw in ADDIE. This would involve breaking down the job, the occupation, the task analysis, and those would kind of lead towards the definition of the learning outcomes. Following on from that, there would be defining education and training requirements, and again, very much what it says on the tin, would involve a needs analysis to determine if training is needed, what training is needed, what tasks should be kind of put forward for instruction, what's the criticality, learning difficulty, frequency of performance, so on and so forth. Following on from this, they develop objective and tests. So objectives, like kind of what we mentioned towards behaviorism already, is really just a definition of what the student should be able to do after instructions, the conditions under which they'd perform, the acceptable standards of performance. So essentially the learning outcomes, which is something we'll talk about a bit later in the module. And the test then is essentially just the test items that will be used to measure whether students had performed effectively on each objectives. Then there's planning, developing, and validating instructions, so designing and producing the course materials, maybe trying it out with some of the test items, and then finally conducting and evaluating instructions. So there'd be an evaluation of the instructional effectiveness, and all of this would be kind of, like we talked about with evaluate in the ADDIE model, all of that would involve kind of feedback and interaction at all points. And you can see here something which is kind of missing from the ADDIE and the Assure model is this kind of bounding area of constraints. And constraints, obviously, because it was 1970, they wouldn't have had kind of, it wasn't developed with kind of digital or kind of e-learning instructional design in mind. So constraints there would be kind of elements like budget, time, availability of resources, individuals, so on and so forth. So I guess it's very much a bit of an aside, but yeah, you could kind of see the 5-step model as maybe informing things like ADDIE. Generally, I guess instructional design models and instructional system design models, they do tend to follow the same kind of steps again and again. Even when we talk about SAM, I mean, there is, SAM also would follow in a slightly different way, but would follow a process of analysis, followed by design, followed by development, followed by implementation and evaluation. So, even though the 5-step model is kind of 50 years old at this stage, you can see the kind of the similarities between that and the models we're talking about nowadays. And a common feature of these models as well is generally they will tend to tell you what to do but not how to do it. And as we talked a bit about like we talked a little bit about during the live session, that tends to make these kind of models, as we saw, very flexible, but also requires quite a bit of adaptation. And anytime you want to use one of these, you are going to have to retool it and repurpose it for your own specific requirements, context, technology, clients, so on and so forth. So all these models, and I guess the 5-step model is no exception. They're quite kind of what I'd say plug and play. You kind of might need to add in components or remove components as you go along and as required. And they tend to be similar with process development models or software development models. Something which was even mentioned in the live session was the idea of a waterfall rather model for design and development. And again, all of these models would follow that kind of similar process. So in 1975, ADDIE first appeared, and ADDIE was developed by the US Army. So it was created at the Center for Educational Technology at Florida State University, and then it was adapted and used by all US Armed Forces. And again, you can see they're very much following on in a similar kind of way from the 5-step approach developed by the Air Force. 5 cyclical phases of analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And there's various kind of adaptations and kind of ways of presenting ADDIE, but generally that is the kind of process which is applied for ADDIE nowadays. And something maybe of note is that initially the ADDIE model consisted of 19 steps. So when it first was produced in 1975 through Florida State University, as you can see in the kind of tagline at the bottom of the image, it consisted of 19 steps as opposed to 5 phases. Yeah, in that very kind of military kind of systematic kind of way, everything is very, very much step by step. So you can see there kind of starting off like everything is extremely kind of granular also. So you would analyze the job, and only after you've analyzed the job would you select the task functions, and after you select the task functions you would construct job performance measures and so on and so forth. So kind of these 19 steps eventually got kind of boiled down into the 5 phases we can identify with the current ADDIE model. So move from like this very, very specific kind of process to the kind of the ADDIE model that we know nowadays, which, as we just mentioned, is certainly far less prescriptive and far kind of broader than the kind of 19 steps. But this 19 steps approach really does kind of provide a very kind of clear kind of blueprint, or very clear set of steps, or at least it did for the kind of developers of it at the time, in terms of the processes involved. So one potentially kind of useful way of maybe using ADDIE, if one were so inclined, might be to take the 5 kind of phases and to potentially, for each different job, if you were to use the ADDIE model, develop something like this. So from the very broad general kind of 5 phase outline, develop your own steps in terms of, okay, under analysis, what are the 6 or 7 things that I'm going to do to give me something usable or specific for this job? For the design elements, what are the steps that I need to be putting in place? So even though this is the older, kind of more ancient version of ADDIE, I think it might have a use. I think there is something to this notion of you have your 5 phases, but from that you're able to spin out a very clear, specific, useful for this particular topic, for this particular client version of ADDIE that you can then apply to great effect. So in addition to ADDIE, we also have the Assure model. And you can see immediately that even from the name alone, there are a number of similar elements between the 2 models. So whereas ADDIE was analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation, the Assure model, somewhat similarly, can be thought of in much the same way, but maybe which has some more detail involved in the language used in the acronym. So instead of analysis, we have analyze learner characteristics. Instead of design, we have select modifier design materials. So the steps involved in ADDIE, in Assure, are to analyze learner characteristics, to state objectives, to select modifier design materials, to utilize materials, to require learner response and evaluation. So even from that process, we can see it is very, very similar to ADDIE. It's a slightly more in-depth, slightly more detailed version of ADDIE, but it really does follow the same process of analyzing your learner and the kind of task at hand, identifying the outcomes to be achieved, designing, or as they put it, select modifier design materials. Instead of development, they have utilized materials, and implementation is to require a learner response, and evaluation, much the same thing. And in various kind of Assure models, we'd see as well, there are variations of Assure which do put the evaluation element at the heart of it and make the entire process somewhat cyclical. So one of the first steps with Assure, like in ADDIE, is to try and define your audience, the learners in question. And again, it would have a very similar kind of process to ADDIE in terms of the analysis phase of ADDIE, in that essentially this kind of notion that you have to know your learners if you're going to select the best strategies for them. So it would follow a similar approach in that it would look for you to gather, demographic information about your learners to try and identify what they already know, what are they able to do by themselves, what are the constraints of the project in terms of time, budget, capacity, so on and so forth. And the notion is that the audience can be analyzed in terms of broad and specific characteristics. So similarly to ADDIE, a couple of maybe questions to ask oneself or to try and use to kind of help arrive to a useful kind of conclusion or a useful set of data. What are the general characteristics of the learners? So a description of them as a whole, and that could be grade, age, gender, socioeconomic factors, cultural elements to be aware of. Entry competencies then would refer to the types of knowledge expected of the learners. So the kind of entry competencies, you might be looking at questions like, do they have the existing knowledge kind of required to take part in the course being developed? Do they have the technical abilities or know-how or the vocabulary to take part? Have they already mastered any of the skills that are being taught? Do they potentially have any biases, any misconceptions? Are they using it in their kind of current job role? So on and so forth. Learning styles is something which is mentioned, and this is a whole other session and a whole other argument. I'm not going to get into it here because learning styles are generally considered to be quite outmoded at this stage. But certainly I would say one consideration instead of learning styles might be to consider if the learners might have if any of the learners would have any visual impairments, any intellectual disabilities. What kind of accessibility features are you going to put in place? What kind of provisions are you going to make for learners who might need some additional help or some alternative ways of viewing the training being put together? And at a minimum, is it accessible in that? Is it going to be usable by all learners regardless of their kind of physical or mental capacity within reason? Requisite skills or knowledge is kind of as it says in the tin. What kind of information do they need to actually undertake the course? What kind of knowledge is assumed? Do they, maybe kind of similar to this, is there a requirement for them to have a certain qualification? You all had to have a particular qualification to kind of take part in this master's. Is something all similar required for the training you are putting together? Motivations, where are they taking the course? Availability, are they going to have the time to undertake and complete the training? So on and so forth. And following on from the analysis stage then would be the first S, the stating of objectives. So stating the objectives essentially involves specifically stating the learning outcomes or the learning objectives for the lesson or for the course. And again, ideally, objectives would be stated, like we kind of covered in behaviorism a little bit, in terms of being measurable, observable, and accessible. So they have to be something that can be assessed or measured or proved in some capacity. Now, I'm going to get into kind of the correct development of learning outcomes later on, because it's something which is pretty critical, for instance, for areas such as third level education and the European qualification framework and other elements. But very briefly, in terms of stating objectives, when we're developing a learning outcome, which is how most kind of learning aims for most programs are kind of expressed in nowadays. For writing a good learning outcome, we would typically need an action word or a verb, ideally based on Bloom's taxonomy. And again, all of that is stuff we're going to be getting into at a later date. A learning statement, which is kind of the learning to be demonstrated, and a criterion or criteria for acceptable performance, or something to indicate what represents a, let's say, not an assessment, but kind of if to do what you would be able to do. Now, again, I'm not going to get too deep into this because it's something we're going to cover at a later stage, but I guess it kind of speaks to the importance of learning outcomes and kind of our objectives and kind of the focus on them, that ADDIE differentiated itself from Assure differentiated itself from ADDIE in that it didn't just go, okay, yeah, analysis, grand. It went, okay, there's going to be analysis phase, and then explicitly you have to state the objectives, you have to state the learning outcomes. So that does kind of refer to the importance of kind of good learning outcomes or good learning objectives. And in terms of, again, the kind of questions we might ask ourselves when looking at this step, we might try and identify, do the objectives that we've developed identify what the expectations are for the learner? So do they make it clear what exactly is going to be expected of the learner? Do they identify the necessary requirements for the learning environment? So given that this is going to take place within a particular learning context or a particular learning environment, are there any requirements that are going to go along with that, which we need to feed into the learning outcomes as well? For example, if we were going to be using some form of asynchronous kind of e-learning course, or alternatively a synchronous course, is there going to be a requirement there which is going to, or will that kind of environment or kind of modality, is that going to bring certain requirements or limitations in terms of, for example, assessment? Do our stated objectives assess learning effectively? So do they kind of, do they give us the opportunity to assess learning in a way which is consistent with the learning outcome outlined? And do our learning outcomes determine the need for appropriate media or material? So do our learning outcomes, the ones that we've put together for this, do they kind of help guide us in terms of identifying the media or the materials or the modality which we're going to use to support the training? So continuing on then to the selection of media and materials. And I guess this stage can be thought of as building a bridge between course beginning to end, by which we mean that you should consider maybe the available materials, the existing materials, the new materials, and kind of what you can use kind of early on in the process, what you need to develop, excuse me, and what you need to kind of tidy up. And the beginnings point, which is the audience present knowledge and skills, and the ending point where they understand the learning that is contained in the course, where they have met the learning outcomes and achieved that. This is the stage where you would be building that instructional bridge that connects those 2 points. And it's important to remember as well that no single media need to be the solution. So text and graphics, video, animation, audio, interactive elements, simulation, so on and so forth. All of these are kind of important steps. So the selection of kind of media and material is kind of it goes beyond necessarily media. It also includes learning material. So it's important to maybe kind of view this stage in that light, that you're not just selecting the multimedia to be used, you're also selecting the actual training content. And as with most things, we should remember to be entirely focused on the student need and the total learning solution. Particularly with bigger projects or more kind of ambitious projects, it's very tempted to get stuck in a process of selecting the best looking media because it'll essentially make the thing look cooler. Everything you do at this stage should be focused on the student need that you'd have identified and the total learning solution. So selection of media material is going to tie into all other elements of your e-learning solution and the assure process, including assessment and evaluation and so on and so forth. So kind of steps involved here might be to, skipped one. No, I didn't. So moving on then, you would look at the process of utilizing the media and the material. So you would be deciding how the material will be used by the students, also by the instructor. And I guess, as is mentioned there, this step is somewhat comparable to a lot of project management processes, where you're going to be deciding how much material will be used, how much detail is going to be, like how deep are you going to go with your detail. And the element that's mentioned there in terms of how the material will be used by the students and by the instructor, very often people don't think about the instructors and how they're going to use the material and what role they will have in the process. It's a little counterintuitive to build something that will be used by instructors who will then be assessing students afterwards, or who will be involved in supporting it somehow. So you want to be sure that you are also giving whatever you develop, whatever you use, you want to be sure that it can be used by an instructor. It's not just going to be you who will be supporting the use of it. It will also be other instructors, other teachers, other trainers, maybe the IT department or IT services within the client's organization might be charged with supporting this. Potentially they have a team of e-learning designer developers who would be kind of implementing it. All of these are things to be thinking about when you're thinking about which media and material to use. So a couple of questions to ask yourself in this area, and this would kind of overlap with the selection of media and material as well as the utilization of media material. Is it selected on the basis of student need? Is it appropriate for the teaching format? Is it appropriate for the technical format? So for the VLE, for the kind of devices that people will have access, that learners will have access to, is it consistent with the students' capabilities and the instructor's teaching style? And does it help meet the learning outcomes? So the selection of media, again, all of that really just kind of harkens back to that kind of important point, that the selection should be based on student need and the total learning solution, and ideally by the instructor's learning needs or kind of teaching requirements also. So in terms of the next step then would be to require learner performance. So this stage is dedicated to ensuring the learners practice what they have learned. So once all this material has been put together, it is important to present learning activities which will allow the learners to practice, potentially even to assess their learning. And you would need to consider how you're going to facilitate it, what feedback would be provided, what material will be used. Are the activities going to be something the learners do kind of by themselves? For instance, like the out of class activities that I ask all of you to do. Are they in kind of class activities where they'll be getting feedback from teachers, in which case will the teachers know enough? Are they familiar enough with the material to be able to give feedback? What type of activities are they going to be? Are they going to be discussion based? Are they going to be games? Are they going to be automated quizzes? And obviously all of those would need to tie very closely into the type of learning to be assessed and the students' capabilities. Another consideration is how are you going to build in time for the learners to be assessed? For instance, with this master's, there is basically kind of a blanket understanding that you have to do the kind of activities in your own time outside of class. For the learners you're developing for, is that feasible for them? Is that are they likely to kind of be able to do that? Do you need to set aside, or does the client need to set aside time to allow them to work on assessment and formative activities? And then the final stage of Assure, to evaluate and revise. So the final step, and one that cannot be overlooked, if this step is skipped over, you're missing a lot, because it's one of the most vital pieces. So evaluating and revising really just involves kind of gathering feedback, determining how successful the element is, or the e-learning solution is, and being able to make appropriate revisions. Assessment would be one part of this, but it wouldn't be the whole of this, and I guess it's important to make that distinction. Assessment is almost for the students, in order for them to be able to evaluate their own learning, and for the, let's say, the trainers who want to be able to evaluate how effective students' learning has been. The evaluation and revision step would be more for yourself as the designer and developer, and for the client, in order to kind of continue to provide the best possible solution. So ways in which you would evaluate could involve any number of different kind of data gathering tools. Learning analytics will tell a lot, assessment will tell a lot, the completion of activities will tell a lot. Apart from that, the use of data gathering tools or kind of evaluation tools, questionnaires, focus groups, interviews, all of these different elements. And evaluation is kind of, I'm going to give more or less an entire class to it. But the evaluation and revision element is something which I suppose should be continuous throughout the process, but there is also going to be a final specific summative evaluation and revision phase.